Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Scope podcast. I'm back with more NFL news. Recently, Ron Clark has been going through a tough time in the media, just from people calling for his job and people, talking about his credibility and how, he shouldn't be in media, things like that. And I'm here to talk about why he should be in media and why he should be with ESPN specifically, because in my opinion, ESPN needs him. So, to preface everything, we live in an era right now where there's a lot of pandering and a lot of sugarcoating the truth, a lot of misinformation, a lot of misdirection, importantly, a lot of misdirection. So, and ESPN is no stranger to this, and they have been difficult to watch over the last decade or so. Growing up as a kid, watching ESPN in the 90s, it was a lot different. Of course, the media has changed so much since then and perceptions and things like that. But watching them back then, it was about sports, and, pretty much that was it. But now ESPN has become more of a clout chasing network, a network that panders to whatever the hippie thing is in society. So whatever the fat, whatever the TikTok trend is, or whatever the social media trend is of the time, they try to copy that. So a lot of time they have a segment called "Stand on Business," where Kendrick Perkins is standing on a block and he's talking about and the block says business. That's one of their little things they do. They were talking about um, glazing one episode, so they do a lot of things to cloud chase and they kind of escape reality and try to embrace the youth a lot and try to pander towards a group of people, but they don't have anybody to keep anything in real. Like Stephen A. Smith, even might be he has elements of it, but for the most part, he keeps everything PC and doesn't tell the truth about things. And he has access to a lot of information that we don't have, which is not his right to share anything, but sometimes he has to get real about his point of view. And when I talk about his point of view, I'm talking about just social issues. So don't circumvent issues, especially when it came to the Boston Celtics coach when Ime Udoka was fired. They kind of they pandered a lot with that and just escaped the truth about that situation. They escaped the truth about a lot of different things that come up in society. Whether it's the Kyrie Irving situation, especially when he was going through his different situations, they did that stuff. But I stopped watching ESPN for a while, especially when Skip left and then he went with Shannon Sharp, and that show was still the best sports show I've ever seen. But I've started watching that show because they were addressing real issues about COVID, um, in regards to Black Lives Matter movement. They started addressing those issues because it affects sports, not just because it's a show that addresses political issues, but how it relates to sports as well. They attacked that issue head on and they didn't sugarcoat anything. They gave the real, they gave their view. They left it all on the table like you're supposed to do. ESPN, however, really didn't cover these issues, and when they did, it felt like a Disney way of doing things. Like you could have had Goofy or Mickey Mouse on the segment talking about it as well. It was very disingenuous. But ESPN, you know, needs Ryan Clark because I've always been a fan of Ryan Clark because I always felt he talked about issues that affected him, but also affected players and affected society in a whole in relations to sports. But he's always addressed issues head on. So when he had issues with Stephen A. Smith, he addressed those head on air. When he had issues with Antonio Brown, or when Antonio Brown had an issue with him, he addressed those head on. But the best issue that he ever addressed head on was when his son, who I believe was at Arizona State at the time, was called a racial slur, I believe, at a restaurant. And he addressed those issues on. He got very emotional about it, very passionate because, that was his son. And he realized that we live in a society where you're not protected from these things as a parent. So, and me being able to relate to that issue as a parent, definitely touched my heart because a lot of things that I've do in my life, I didn't realize I was being really self-conscious about. So every time I go out, to feel safe, most of the time I wear, even though I know it sounds kind of crazy because it doesn't stop you from racism. But I always wear, dress clothes, and I always have a bow tie. Or sometimes I have a regular tie, but most of the time it's a bow tie because it looks disarming to those who might be racist towards me. I used to always drive a minivan for, probably close to a decade. I drove a minivan because I felt like if I was driving, I'd be less likely to be profiled. So a lot of these things that we do, uh, or I did, was, being self conscious of what others might think. Because a lot of time people thought I was dressing nice just because I was trying to be fancy or trying to be better than other people. It wasn't that. It was just because I didn't want to be profiled. I didn't want to be looked at a certain way. I didn't want to be a victim of racism, overt racism, I say, because it's always going to be coverted racism. But I didn't want to be a victim of overt racism. And even I still have those same feelings today when I go to a grocery store in regular clothing. I'm looked at a certain way, but when I put the dress clothes on, I'm respected more. People address me differently. But that's just the life of being, a black man in America. And Ron Clark addressed these issues a lot, and he makes you feel like you're not alone in this world to where those issues arise. And a lot of times when we go to tough situations, we look for people who have those same situations to help us in those situations, because you can go to a counselor and things like that, but most of the time there's going to be people from not where you came from, people that don't have those same experiences. Ryan Clark, to be in such an advantageous position that he's in, he still has to deal with those same issues, and that lets me know that you're not alone in this fight, and you still have hope, and then you still have an avenue to express these things. But Ryan Clark, I think, is similar to that mold of Jamel Hill, because she was very vocal in her opposition to the presidency at the time, and I believe that became a part of her exodus from the network and ESPN. But ESPN wasn't genuine anyway. So I believe that Jamel Hill was just too real for the network, and her having her own voice and having her voice kind of muffled, or just being pushed to the side is kind of it's disheartening, especially when we're supposed to have freedom of speech and things like these. But I think for the most part, God doesn't make any mistakes. He puts you in a situation where you're supposed to be, because sometimes we get too complacent in a spot where we shouldn't be, because He knows we're supposed to be better than that. So Ryan Clark, even if he has exited from ESPN, he still has his powerful show, The Pivot. He's very pivotal on that show, no pun intended. But him with Channing Crowder and Fred Taylor, great NFL players, all of them. But they have strong voices, and they address a lot of things that ESPN would never address, like mental health, social issues, just being a player and having to balance life and things like that. Because ESPN is on a network of Disney, and I believe Disney has an effect on things. Because I remember growing up as a kid watching Disney, and even Nickelodeon, watching cartoon shows and stuff like that, and shows, they didn't really prepare you for life. ESPN, I feel like, doesn't prepare players for what's coming next for them if you're in college or high school. It gives you this happy-go-lucky mentality, or happy-go-lucky uh, facade that they present. They present this heavy facade, and that's the illusion of Disney and Nickelodeon and even Noggin Network and things like that we watched as growing up as kids, because they didn't talk about losing loved ones, or um, love loss, and losing, just losing relationships and things like that. They didn't teach you those things. They just taught you about the happy times, and it might be some small issues like somebody lost a wallet or something like that, but it's not anything prepared for what reality is going to hit you with. And I believe Ryan Clark gives ESPN that type of realism that they need to prepare people coming up, and people that's trying to go through things to be able to go through. So that is why I think Ryan Clark is needed at ESPN or any network, especially when it comes to sports, because sometimes you have to give a realist point of view. But as always, thanks for tuning into Urban Scope Podcast. And until next time, I'll see you next time.